The rain tapped gently against the window, a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to my days. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The house was too quiet now, the kind of quiet that made the walls seem to close in. The kids were gone off to college, building their own lives, and Amir was in another city, another meeting, another excuse to be somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't here. I stared out at the gray haze of Seattle, the drizzle blurring the edges of the world outside. My mind wandered, as it often did these days, to the past. To a time when the house was alive with laughter, with chaos, with purpose. Now, it felt like I was just going through the motions. Wake up, clean up, cook, clean again. Repeat. The days blurred together, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was fading into the background of my own life. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Amir's cousin, Ahmed. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I was in the mood for small talk. "Jamila," he said, his voice warm but with a hint of urgency. "I need a favor." I raised an eyebrow, though he couldn't see it. "What kind of favor?" "My son, Khalil," he began, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "He's starting an internship in Seattle. I was wondering if he could stay with you for a few months, just until he finds his footing." I blinked, taken aback. It had been years since we'd had a house guest, years since the house had felt full. My first instinct was to say no, to protect the fragile routine I'd built. But then I thought of the silence, the endless hours of nothingness, and something inside me softened. Of course, I heard myself say, surprising even myself. A week later, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a towel, smoothing it down my skirt as I walked to the door. Why am I nervous? I thought, scolding myself. He's just a kid. But when I opened the door, the word kid evaporated from my mind. Khalil stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark eyes framed by lashes that seemed too long for a man. His smile was easy, confident, and it lit up his face in a way that made something stir deep inside me. God, he's beautiful. The thought came unbidden, and I quickly pushed it away. "Aunt Jamila," he said, his voice deep and smooth like honey. "Thank you for letting me stay with you." I smiled, hoping it didn't look as forced as it felt. "Of course, Khalil. Come in, come in. You'll catch a cold standing out there." He stepped inside, the energy of his presence immediately filling the space. He wasn't just a person, he was a force, and I could feel the air shift around him. I showed him to the guest room, trying to ignore the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his presence seemed to awaken something in me that I'd thought was long dead. The days that followed were different. Khalil was polite, charming, and effortlessly attentive. He helped with the dishes without being asked, made me laugh with stories of his travels, and even offered to cook dinner one night. His touch was fleeting, a hand on my shoulder as he passed, a brush of fingers as he handed me a cup of tea, but each time, it sent a shiver through me. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the rain pattering against the windows, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck, Aunt Jamila? Like you're waiting for something, but you don't know what?" The question caught me off guard, and I found myself staring at him, my heart pounding. Yes, the word echoed in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I shrugged, trying to keep my voice light. Life is full of phases. Some are just quieter than others. He tilted his head, studying me in a way that made me feel exposed, as if he could see right through me. "Quiet can be lonely," he said softly. I looked away, my throat tight. "It can." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't have to be." The air between us crackled with something unspoken, something dangerous and intoxicating. My breath caught, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe altogether. His eyes held mine, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of something I couldn't name. "Khalil," I started, my voice trembling. But before I could say more, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was electric, and I felt a jolt of something raw and primal surge through me. "Jamila," he murmured, his voice low and filled with a heat that made my stomach tighten. "Tell me to stop, and I will." I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. "This is wrong," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. "This is so wrong." But another voice, louder and more insistent, said, "This is what you've been waiting for." His hand slid up my arm, his touch sending shivers down my spine, and I felt myself leaning into him, my resolve crumbling. "Khalil," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "Don't fight it," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "Not with me." And then his lips were on mine, soft and demanding, and the world fell away. The rain tapped steadily against the window, a rhythmic hum that mirrored the chaos in my chest. I pulled away from Khalil, my breath shallow, my heart pounding as if it might escape my ribs. His dark eyes stayed locked on mine, unwavering, intense, as though he could see every thought wrestling within me. What have I done? The question looped in my mind, sharp and unrelenting. "Jamila," he said softly, his voice low, almost pleading. His hand lingered on my arm, his touch like a brand I couldn't erase. I stepped back, the distance between us feeling both necessary and unbearable. "We can't," I said, my voice trembling. "This can happen." He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with that same quiet confidence that had drawn me in from the moment he arrived. How had it come to this? I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could hold the pieces of my life together. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in, the air heavy with what had just passed between us. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice steady but with an edge of something pain, maybe, or frustration. "Why can't it?" I turned to face him, my chest tight. "Because I'm married." "Because you're—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Because you're young. Because you're everything I'm not supposed to want." He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between us. "What if that doesn't matter?" he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "What if this is about us? About how we feel?" I shook my head, my throat burning with unshed tears. "It's not that simple." "It could be," he insisted, his hand reaching for mine, his fingers warm and steady. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Jamila. I see you. I see how much you've given up, how much you've lost. Let me be here for you." His words cut through me, sharp and true. I had been alone in a house that echoed with the absence of my children, alone in a marriage that had become more routine than romance. Amir was gone more often than he was home, and when he was here, it felt like we were strangers sharing a life, but not a connection. Khalil's presence had been a spark in the darkness, a reminder of who I used to be, who I still could be. But that didn't make it right. What about Amir? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What about what this would do to him? To us? Khalil's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not asking you to choose," he said. "I'm just asking you to feel. To let yourself feel." I closed my eyes, his words wrapping around me like a warm blanket, tempting and dangerous. Let yourself feel. How long had it been since I'd allowed myself that? How long had I buried my desires, my needs, under the weight of responsibility and expectation? When I opened my eyes, he was still there, waiting, his expression soft but determined. The rain outside seemed to slow, the room falling into a stillness that made the air between us crackle with tension. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. He stepped closer, his hand brushing my cheek, his touch so gentle it made my breath catch. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," he murmured. "Just take it one moment at a time." I wanted to pull away, to put distance between us, but I couldn't. His presence was magnetic, his warmth drawing me, and despite the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. "This is wrong," it said again, but the words felt hollow, distant. "What if I regret this?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, soft and knowing. "What if you don't?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. For the first time in years, I felt alive, truly alive, like a part of me that had been dormant was waking up. And yet, there was fear of what this meant, fear of the fallout, fear of losing myself in something I couldn't control. Khalil's thumb traced a slow, deliberate path along my cheek, his gaze never leaving mine. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "Just be here, with me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing, my body betraying me with every breath. His touch was a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of the void I'd been teetering on for so long. "Khalil," I whispered, his name a plea, a question, a surrender. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady, sure. "And I'm not going anywhere." The rain outside seemed to fade into the background, the world shrinking to just the two of us in that moment. I could feel the weight of everything I'd been carrying begin to shift, the walls I'd built around myself starting to crack. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I hesitated, the question echoing in the stillness. What do I want? It was a question I hadn't allowed myself to ask in years, not until he'd walked into my life and turned everything upside down. I started, but the words caught in my throat. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "It's okay," he murmured. "You don't have to say it. Just show me." My heart pounded, my chest tight, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I reached for him, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest. His heartbeat thrummed beneath my palm, steady and strong, and for a moment, it felt like everything else fell away. The space between us disappeared, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was soft but insistent, a question and an answer all at once. I felt myself giving in, the weight of my fears and doubts melting away as I let myself be present, be here with him. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The rain tapped softly against the window, a steady rhythm that mirrored the chaos in my chest. Khalil's lips left mine, but the warmth of his touch lingered, pulling me into a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. I stared at him, my breath shallow, my mind racing. His dark eyes held mine, unwavering, as if he could see every doubt, every fear, every longing I'd buried deep inside. "Jamila," he whispered, his voice soft but laced with something raw, something that made my stomach twist. "You don't have to hide from me." I shook my head, my hands trembling as they fell to my sides. "I'm not hiding," I lied, my voice barely audible. But I was. Hiding from the truth, from the reality of what this moment meant. Hiding from the way my heart raced whenever he was near, the way his presence made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. "Then why do you look like you're about to run?" His question was gentle, but it cut through me like a knife. "Because I should. Because I'm married. Because this is wrong." The thoughts screamed in my head, but my body betrayed me, leaning into him instead of pulling away. His scent, something warm and earthy, wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into this dangerous dance. "I can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I shouldn't." Khalil's fingers traced my jawline, his touch featherlight but electric. "Can't what? Feel? Want? Be happy." His words were soft, but they carried a weight that left me speechless. "You're allowed to want more, Jamila. You're allowed to be more." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I shook my head. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" His voice was firm now, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't ready to give. "Because of him? Because of what people will think? Or because you're afraid of what this means for you?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. All of it. Every word he said was true, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Amir's face flashed in my mind, his distant smile, his absent affection. Our marriage had become a routine, a series of empty gestures and silent dinners. But it was still my life, the one I'd built for over 20 years. How could I just walk away from that? Khalil's hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "You're not a prisoner, Jamila. You don't have to live like one." His words struck a chord deep within me, a part of me I'd locked away for so long. The part that craved connection, passion, life. I looked up at him, my heart pounding as I searched his face for answers. "And what if I'm scared?" I admitted, my voice trembling. "What if I'm scared of what happens next?" His lips curved into a small, understanding smile. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said softly. "But don't let fear keep you from living." The honesty in his words, the sincerity in his eyes, broke something loose inside me. I felt my resolve crumbling, the walls I'd built around myself cracking under the weight of his presence. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached for him, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as I pulled him closer. Our lips met again, this time with the urgency that left me breathless. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me against him as if he were afraid I'd vanish if he let go. I melted into him, my body responding to his touch in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. Every brush of his fingers, every press of his lips, ignited something inside me, something that had been dormant for far too long. But as the intensity of the moment grew, so did the guilt. It crept in, a shadow at the edge of my mind, threatening to pull me back into reality. I pulled away slightly, my chest heaving as I looked up at him. "Khalil," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are we doing?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out what I needed to hear. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But I know I don't want to stop. And I don't think you do either." I opened my mouth to protest, to remind him of all the reasons this was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt myself nodding, my heart leading the way even as my mind screamed in protest. He leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise and a question all at once. And for the first time, I didn't pull away. I let myself fall, let myself feel, let myself want. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady drumbeat that drowned out the world beyond this moment. But even as I lost myself in him, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the fear, the guilt, the knowledge that this was a line I could never uncross. "Jamila," Khalil murmured against my lips, his voice low and husky. "Let me show you that it's okay to want this. To want me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could respond, he leaned in again, his kiss deeper, more insistent. My hands tangled in his hair as I kissed him back, the world around us fading into nothingness. But deep down, I knew this couldn't last. The reality of my choices, the consequences of this moment, would eventually catch up to me. And when they did, I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to face them. The rain continued its rhythmic patter against the windows, a soothing backdrop to the storm raging inside me. Khalil's hands were still at my waist, his touch both grounding and electrifying. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, the way his eyes lingered on my face, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give him. "You're thinking too much," he said softly, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from my cheek. "Just let go, Jamila. Just for tonight. Just for tonight." The words hung in the air, a tempting promise that tugged at the edges of my resolve. But how could I? How could I let myself fall into this without thinking about the morning? About Amir's empty side of the bed, about the life I'd built and the vows I'd taken? "Khalil," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't know what you're asking." His expression softened, and he stepped closer, his chest brushing against mine. "I'm not asking you to forget everything, Jamila. I'm just asking you to feel, to be here with me in this moment. Isn't that enough?" I closed my eyes, torn between the weight of his words and the heaviness in my chest. Inside me, there was a battle, a war between who I was and who I could be. The woman I thought I'd settled into, the wife, the mother, the caretaker, and this other version of myself, one I hadn't dared to acknowledge in years. A version that craved more than quiet dinners and empty conversations, more than the loneliness that had become my constant companion. When I opened my eyes, Khalil was still there, his gaze steady, unwavering. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation, just an openness that made my heart ache. "You deserve to feel alive," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve more than just existing." The words struck a chord deep within me, a chord I'd tried to silence for so long. I thought of the years I'd spent packing lunches, attending school events, waiting for Amir to come home from work, only to have him arrive too tired to talk, too distracted to see me. I thought of the way my days blurred together, one after another, until I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt like me. And now, standing here with Khalil, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: desire. Not just for him, though there was certainly that, but for myself. For the life I'd put on hold, the dreams I'd buried under layers of responsibility and duty. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know who I am anymore, Khalil. I don't know who I'm supposed to be." He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "You're Jamila," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "That's enough. You're enough." Tears spilled over my cheeks, hot and unbidden. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this moment wasn't just a fleeting escape, but a chance to rediscover something I'd lost. But the fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, whispering all the reasons why this was wrong. "Hey," Khalil said softly, brushing away my tears with his thumb. "It's okay to be scared. But don't let that fear stop you from living, Jamila. Don't let it keep you trapped." His lips met mine then, a tender kiss that was both a question and an answer. I felt myself melting into him, the tension in my body slowly unraveling as I gave in to the moment. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, his touch igniting a fire I hadn't known still burned within me. But even as I kissed him, even as I allowed myself to feel, I couldn't silence the voice in my head. The voice that reminded me of Amir, of the vows we'd taken, of the life we'd built together. "I can't," I whispered against Khalil's lips, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. "I can't do this to him. To us." Khalil's expression shifted, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name crossing his face. But he didn't let go of me. Instead, he leaned his forehead against mine, his breath mingling with mine in the space between us. "This isn't about him, Jamila," he said quietly. "This is about you. About what you want, what you need. You've spent so long putting everyone else first. When do you get to be first?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense in the light of day. But here, in the dim glow of the kitchen, with the rain still falling outside, I allowed myself to consider it. To consider him. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what I want." Khalil's lips curved into a small, understanding smile. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just let yourself feel, Jamila. Let yourself be." His words were a lifeline, a permission I hadn't realized I needed. And so, against my better judgment, I let go. I let myself sink into the moment, into the warmth of his arms, into the way he made me feel seen, alive. Our kisses grew deeper, more urgent, as if we were trying to make up for all the time we'd lost. His hands roamed my back, his touch setting my skin ablaze. I could feel the racing of his heart against my chest, the way he trembled ever so slightly, as if he were holding back just as much as I was. And then, without warning, he pulled back, his breathing ragged as he searched my face. "Jamila," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I need you to tell me this is what you want. I need to hear you say it." My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of his words pressing down on me. This was it, the moment of truth. I could step back, retreat into the safety of my old life, or I could take a leap into the unknown. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The fear was still there, but so was something else. Something I hadn't felt in years, hope. I stared at Khalil, his dark eyes searching mine, his hands still warm on my skin. The air between us was thick, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of a decision I wasn't sure I was ready to make. My heart was a wild thing, thrashing against my ribs, and I could feel the echo of it in my throat, where the words I needed to say seemed stuck. I could step back. I could retreat. But something in me resisted the thought. Something I hadn't felt in years. Was it courage? Desire? Or just the aching need to feel alive again after so long of merely existing? "Jamila," Khalil said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I need to know this is what you want. Not just for me, but for you. For you." His words reached something deep inside me, something I'd buried beneath years of routine and responsibility. I thought of Amir, of the way he'd been gone more than he'd been home lately, his absences stretching longer and longer until I'd stopped counting the days. I thought of the silence that had filled our house since the kids had left, the way it had become my constant companion. And then I thought of Khalil, his laughter, his energy, the way he looked at me like I was something worth seeing. I started, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I want, but I know I don't want to feel this emptiness anymore." His eyes softened, and he reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was so gentle, so full of care, that it made my chest ache. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said. "But you don't have to keep pretending either." His words were like a key turning in a lock, releasing something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding onto. I felt tears prickle at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I didn't want to cry. I just wanted to feel. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. "I know," Khalil said, his thumb tracing a line down my cheek. "So am I. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing, the faint hum of the world outside the window, and the pounding of my own heart. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw not just the youthful charm and confidence he wore so easily, but something deeper, something real. And then, Before I could overthink it, I leaned in and kissed him. This time, it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was raw and real, a release of all the emotions I'd been holding back. His hands tightened on my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in the moment. In him. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. Khalil rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed as if he was savoring the moment. "Jamila," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You have no idea how much I've wanted this." I felt a shiver run through me at his words, but it wasn't from fear this time. It was something else, something warm and alive and utterly intoxicating. We stood there for what felt like forever, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside forgotten. But eventually, reality began to creep back in. The questions, the doubts, the fear of what this meant and what it would cost. I pulled back slightly, my hands resting on his chest as I looked up at him. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Khalil hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the knot of uncertainty in my stomach. I wanted to believe him, to believe that this could be something good, something real. But the weight of my choices, of the life I'd built and the promises I'd made, pressed down on me. "I need to think," I said, stepping back and running a hand through my hair. I need to figure out what this means." Khalil nodded, his expression understanding, but tinged with a hint of disappointment. "Take your time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." I hesitated, torn between the urge to stay and the need to retreat, to find some space to think. In the end, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the quiet of the kitchen. I went upstairs to my bedroom, closing the door behind me and leaning against it for a moment. My heart was still racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the rain-soaked streets below. The familiar view offered no answers, no clarity. I thought of Amir, of the life we'd built together. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been ours. And yet, somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being us. We'd become strangers sharing a house, two people going through the motions. And then there was Khalil. He was everything Amir wasn't: young, vibrant, alive.